Hi, my name's James. I paint miniatures.
This is Spoon 37 Minis. Welcome to What's on the Bench, episode 5. Here I will be base coating the first colour on a metal Tyranid Hive Tyrant. The colour I'm using here is Games Workshop Mephiston Red base, which is being used as the flesh colour on this Hive Tyrant, and I'm just applying the very first coat starting around the base of the left leg here. Now I know some people like to know the details of what I'm doing, so I've got the model on a 60mm base, so I'm using the Citadel XL paint handle and a Games Workshop S base brush, so that's the smallest base brush that they do as far as I know, because there isn't an excess size in that particular style. I'm using this small brush so that it gets into all the nooks and crannies. You could use a bigger brush, but you might then have to go over it with a smaller one later just to get into all those cracks and crevices. Now, as I get more of this painted, you will notice that I'm deliberately skipping several areas. The idea of this is to firstly remind myself which areas are going to be black later on, but also just to make sure that I have all of the red flesh areas covered, and then anything that's going to be a different colour later I will not be painting at this point. I don't mind if there's a little bit of overlap though. I'd rather have a little bit of overlap and then come back to it later, and maybe, for example, the overlapping armour plates, the carapace, may get painted black before painting the blue lines or striations on them. So I'm just skipping essentially as much as I can. I know some people, particularly if you're using an airbrush, would at this point just completely cover the model, but that's not how I like to do it. I like to keep the separation between what's going to be red and what isn't at this point. Now you can see the open Mephiston Red paint pot in the background, but you will notice that I'm not taking paint directly from the paint pots. I've already put some onto the palette where it's being watered down quite heavily. This is quite a thin coat of paint. Now, being a base paint from the Games Workshop range, that means that it still has quite good coverage with even one coat, but it is thin enough that I will most likely need 2 thin coats. Now, you might think that's a waste of time, but the idea is if you were to use one thick coat, you'd actually cover up a lot of the details that you've paid for with the miniature, and a lot of these minis aren't cheap. You can see now I'm actually getting a little bit more paint because I think it's too thin. It's got a bit thin on that leg. But you don't want to use a coat that's too thick to obscure the details, so you use very thin coats of paint. And that's really what the palette and the water pot are really for, apart from obviously washing the brushes. And so this is the first coat. I am going to show a second coat going on later, which is a bit of a first for this channel, and I'm not sure if people will like it, but obviously let me know one way or another. Now here you can see it looks like I'm being a bit messy compared to the previous foot hoof area. I'm actually overlapping quite heavily with the hoof on the Hive Tyrant. That will be perfectly fine. This is just, making sure that I get every part of the flesh covered, and then later on when I paint the hooves, I'll initially paint them black and then they fade to grey in 3 or 4 layers. So I'll actually cut back in with some Abaddon black and make sure that those recesses where I've heavily gone over the edges will all be covered black before I actually paint the hoof, and that'll be the same for the armour plates, the claws and anything else that will need to have a good separation between the red flesh and a completely different colour. That's obviously going to happen later on though. one of the difficulties I have with this model is obviously it's an old metal model from 2nd edition Warhammer 40,000, so there's a degree of interpretation from the old box art compared to the modern style of how you would normally do a modern Tyranid kit, because of course if you were to buy a Hive Tyrant now, it would be a much larger multi-part plastic kit, and it doesn't have quite the same distribution of details that this one does. So I'm having to use a little bit of artistic license to pick and choose which bits should be red and which bits should not at this point. Because if you actually look at the old box art, some bits are red, some bits are pinky purple, some bits are blue. It's a real mixture of colours, whereas the modern Hive Fleet Behemoth colours that I'm going for tend to be much more consistent, tending to be predominantly red flesh and predominantly black carapace. Now, this is a hobby for me, and I paint these minis in my spare time, and I actually painted this over several days. So there's a clip coming up where I'm talking about what colour to paint the chest, where I say I've slept on the problem. I mean that quite literally. Actually, these clips were shot, I think, on a Tuesday, and then on the Wednesday I shot the clip coming up where I'd actually been thinking about how I should paint the chest relative to all the other colours on the model. So it might seem odd when it's all presented as one continuous piece of footage, but actually this was recorded over several days. Okay, so I'm a bit puzzled as to whether I should paint this chest carapace red, like the rest of the flesh, or black with the blue lines, like this large carapace area should be. I've been thinking about it, and the old box art from the 2nd edition codex, it has it red. My old Tyranid Hive Tyrant that I've repainted in 1999 also has it the same flesh colour, although obviously this flesh colour is blue. The only counter argument is when I've painted this Lictor, and to a lesser degree the Tyranid Warriors, the chest plates were painted black with the blue lines. But I think on balance, because the Hive Tyrant has all this black carapace around all over its body, I think the chest should still be painted the red flesh colour. So I've kind of slept on it, thought about it, gonna paint it red. So yeah, after that brief interlude, thinking I was done with the red on the torso, actually I've got to now paint the chest. Now you will notice this paint is very thin down in order to run into all the textures in between the ribcage, which is supposed to look like you know, the innards or something of the alien creature. And it just means it's got a lot of texture, and you need the paint to be extremely runny to get into all those little details and the sort of ridges and so on. Obviously, once you've done 2 thin coats of red, no one will notice that you had it particularly thin the first time, but you do have to do that second coat to make it look good. Now we can move on to the other parts of the model. As you would have seen in the primer video, I actually separated this kit into what's known as sub-assemblies. So this is a two-part piece of the model, the tail and the tail tip. And now I'm just painting on the first coat of Mephiston Red. Now, as before with the chest, this is still quite watered down. In fact, I believe I'm using exactly the same mixture here. And there are a lot of little details for the paint to run into, particularly between the red flesh colour and the edge of the carapace. There's a series of divots or sort of dome sections that actually you need to get paint into, and it's very easy to miss. Also, of course, all the ridges along here need paint in them, although partly that's to do with the direction you move the brush in. And this is a good piece for showing how thin the paint is and how that it doesn't quite make perfect coverage the first time with a thin coat, but trust me, it's much better to have two thin coats to get your colour coverage rather than trying to cut corners and paint it with one thick coat, which is going to obscure all of these details, which is ultimately what you are paying your money for. It was about at this point I realised I might not have mounted the tail in the best way for painting. The brass wire, thin though it is, still seemed to be getting in the way slightly, but at this point I'm not quite sure how else to mount it, so awkward though it is, I've just got to live with it for now. Now here we are moving on to the head section. Now unfortunately what I didn't record and didn't realise until it was too late was there is a little bit of red around the tail tip. There's a kind of jaw and a piece at the base of the pincers that actually got painted red as well. I'll try and record stuff like that in future, I just missed it this time. But same again with the head. I have actually thickened the mixture ever so slightly. I felt it was a bit too thin on the tail, so although it still runs into the details here, it's actually slightly thicker. I've just added some paint to it straight out of the pot just to thicken the mixture because it was getting far too runny. Now there is a section here at the back of the head on top which I'm not sure if it needs to be covered or if it's actually a sort of mating face that will need to have glue on it later. So as I'm not sure, I'm actually covering it with primer and base paint. That way, worst case scenario, I have to scrape some paint off later on. Best case scenario, it's covered and there won't be any gaps or missing bits that should be painted. And of course, if it is right in there up against the body, if it's a little bit darker than the surroundings, it won't actually matter because it'll just be a small area that nobody really sees. Again, much like with the body and the tail, I'm just skipping any sections that I believe will be other colours later on. Obviously, not all of these sections will be black, and I'm covering areas like the teeth, which will actually be painted a bone colour later on, just so that they have some kind of background to them rather than leaving them bare. Moving on to the whip arm. This is the lower of the two left arms, which are actually separate. The two right arms are both holding onto the same gun, so they tend to go together. The upper left arm is holding a bone sword, but this one's holding a whip. Now, unfortunately, I have had to reconstruct this whip from bits of wire, green stuff, and some plaster styrene, because the bits were missing when I got the model from eBay. I've tried to assemble it in a fashion that makes it look like it was deliberately converted to be a whip, sort of splaying out as it's used, rather than just replacing missing parts. Same principle again, just trying to get a thin coat of Mephiston Red into all of the little details here. Now you will notice when I paint this, again like the body and so on, I'm actually stopping short of painting the spikes on the elbow and the whip itself. There will be a slight overlap, but again it's simply because these areas are going to be in different colours, so I believe the whip will most likely be painted mid-grey, just like the other Tyranid bioweapons that I've used, so like the gun will also be a mid-grey. And the spikes and the nails and so on will be black fading into shades of grey. The nails on this side of the hand, however, simply in order to get the red flesh colour into all of the little details, I've had to actually overpaint the nails, even though I wouldn't really want to. It's just the way it goes together. And then of course when I actually come to paint the nails, I'll paint them black once more, which is a lot easier than trying to paint those or leave them completely black and then try and get paint into, like, in between the nails to paint the fingers. Moving on to the upper left arm, as mentioned before, this has a bone sword. And so we're just base coating the arm, ignoring the black carapace shoulder pad, which out of context looks enormous but should actually fit in with the rest of the model. And then obviously I'm doing all of the detail on the arm and the hand, again overpainting the nails but largely ignoring the sword. At this point I'm not entirely sure what colour the melee weapon should be. I can paint it a conventional bone colour, rather like I'll do the teeth on the Hive Tyrant, but I paint most of the other bones like claws and hooves and so on. I've actually painted black fading to grey, which seems to be the official colour scheme, so I might paint the bone sword that colour. I haven't quite decided yet. As you can probably tell, some of these deep details with the deep ridges in the elbow and the ridges on the upper arm are giving me a little bit of trouble. They need watered down paint to flow into the details, but then you also need to make sure that every last little bit is painted, so I'm just checking it from all angles, making sure to get paint in everywhere that it's needed. Now, unlike the previous arm, this underside of the arm has a number of rather thin details with a kind of deep crevice in the forearm, so you've got to be sure to get paint in there just to make sure that it has some colour coverage before moving on to further steps. The hands are, however, pretty much the same on both arms, and in fact you'll see coming up on the final piece, the two arms are actually both holding the gun, so you paint them both at roughly the same time. Now when it comes to painting the hand area, particularly around the handguard on the sword, there are some extremely deep crevices to get the paint into, and merely having the paint watered down isn't enough. It's one of those unfortunate cases where you have to poke the brush directly into the crevices. It's something that isn't very good for your brush, but sometimes it has to be done simply to get the paint in where it is needed. And finally we have the two right arms, which are both holding on to the gun. Now, it's a quirk of how I paint that I tend to do each arm completely separately. I'm not entirely sure why I do it that way, but you'll see I'll do the lower arm completely and then the upper arm completely. Now you can see here why I'm doing this in sub-assemblies. To get to the underside of the arms, it would be extremely difficult to paint this area because it would be right up against the rib cage, and so trying to get paint on these details would be almost impossible if I'd fully constructed the model. Instead, by painting it in sub-assemblies, it actually makes extremely light work of doing these areas, and as such it makes it very easy and very much more relaxed to paint a model like this, which otherwise would be extremely difficult to paint. It's also worth noting that the original sculpt of this model has a lot of fine details actually on the inside and the underside of the arms, and so it seems a shame not to have them properly painted by leaving them in sub-assemblies like this and then assembling the model after they've been painted, which is what I fully intend to do. Having completely done the lower arm, I'll move on to doing the upper arm. This one's a bit more tricky because not only are there some of these deep details that I'm painting, but actually the underside of the arm and the inside of the arm have additional like veins and cable looking things that might not be that obvious at this step, but it's actually making it quite difficult to get paint in some of the recesses, and it is a bit of an awkward area to get to even with the sub-assemblies, so do bear that in mind if you're trying to follow and try painting one of these models. Now I'm coming up to the end of the first coat of Mephiston Red on these models. Normally this would be around where I would actually end the video, but instead, coming up, I've got a bit of a bonus for you. I've actually recorded painting the second coat of Mephiston Red, which I wouldn't normally do, but I thought why not. Okay, now I don't always show this because it can get repetitive, but I decided as I've recorded it, I might as well show you. I always say that I do two thin coats, but I don't always actually show it on camera. So here I'm actually applying the second coat of Mephiston Red. If you look closely at the body, particularly around the rib cage, you will actually notice that the paint is extremely thin and it has actually got little bits of the original black primer showing through, even on areas that at a glance look like they're well covered. And of course some areas are well covered with one coat, some areas are not. This just makes sure that every last little bit has that same consistency and vibrancy of colour that you're expecting from this base paint. I know some people like to get away with just one coat, and that's fine, but I tend to find 2 thin coats does the trick every time. Now, I would like it if people like this, or if they hate it, let me know in the comments. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what people want to see on this channel, so if you want to literally see every single step of how the miniature goes from completely unpainted to completely finished, I can do that. But also, if you want me to skip repetitive steps like this one, just let me know. Now, in order that I don't miss anything, you'll notice that I'm painting this in pretty much exactly the same pattern. I'm taking it a little bit slower this time, a bit more care and attention to detail, just to make sure that the paint goes on nicely with no, defects or bubbles or what have you. But other than that, the technique is largely the same. You have to let it dry in between the first coat and the second coat, but really the pace at which I paint, that's not normally a particular problem. Doing it in this order just ensures that I paint every last bit of the model. It should be fairly obvious if I've missed a bit. 1, it won't look wet, and 2, it'll still be a bit thin and might have primer showing through. But even so, I still try to paint things in exactly the same order each time, just to keep it simpler for me. Now, if you were painting to a tabletop standard, then just the 2 coats of Mephiston Red would actually be sufficient, because of course with the tabletop standard you can always come back and paint in the shades and the highlights if you want to later on, but the idea of the tabletop is just to get roughly the right colours in roughly the right places so you can get it on the table and playing your war game as quickly as possible. So if you were just doing that, you could stop at 2 coats of Mephiston Red. I'm of course going to take it a bit further. That will be coming up in a future video. Of course I'm only doing the base coating in this one, but if you were trying to follow along, copying what I'm doing, or maybe painting modern Hive Tyrant or some other Tyranid in the same kind of way, you could stop at just 2 thin coats of Mephiston Red and move straight on to painting the black carapace with the blue lines. Now, keen-eyed viewers will notice that I'm no longer using an S base brush. It does occasionally show that it says S Artificier Layer, which is a fine, but not extremely fine, layer brush made by the Games Workshop. This is one of the reasons why I'm going a little bit slower. It is a smaller brush, it holds less paint, but it also gets into all of the cracks and crevices, all the small details and so on, much more easily than the slightly larger base brush. Using this finer brush also allows me to do things like getting right up against the edge of the carapace with a lot less overpainting, so there's a lot less to correct later on. So whilst I don't always do it this way, it can be a good idea to do your second coat with a slightly smaller tip brush, just so that you make sure to cover all of those details and not miss anything. there is a lot of detail, and then this thin area underneath the sort of main torso and rib cage, there's a lot of sort of sinewy lines and so on, and there's a bit between the kind of pelvis carapace and the carapace above that probably also needs to be flesh colour. Using a slightly smaller brush just makes it a little bit easier to paint this area and actually still hit all of those details without missing anything. Now you can see here what a difference a second coat makes. Already I've just put the second coat on this area and it's already much more vibrant, particularly up against the carapace there, which I'm intending to keep red and just have the edge of the carapace black, and then the carapace on top will obviously be black. You'll see the same thing again when I do the other side, where it's particularly showing a lot of the black paint underneath, and then when I put the second coat of Mephiston on, suddenly it's completely red. Now of course I'm not actually doing it on this model, but if you wanted a fade from black to red, you could also do it in this manner by layering thin paints or glazing between the black and the red. That's kind of out of the scope of this video, and I'm not very practiced at glazing, so I'm inclined not to show it, but I'm just going to mention it here because obviously if you can get very thin paint over black, it's not going to show bright red, and then more coats you do, it's going to look more and more sort of vivid red as you go along. You can now see how the colour is intensifying, particularly around the chest area, and this should make a nice flat red colour once it's all done. Despite all of the tiny details around here, it's still going to be all completely red, and then when I use a wash on it, it will actually show all of those fine ridges that I was painting over earlier with some difficulty will show up in sharp relief, so it'll be time well spent getting this stage right. Now I wasn't sure about this kind of shroud section with all the veiny looking bits either side of the head. I felt they could remain dark, but I thought it's probably going to look better if I do a full coat of Mephiston Red and then use a wash, but then just leave it dark like several other areas will be later on. Moving on to the separate tail section. This is another area that really badly shows how thin the original coat of paint was. You can see almost immediately as I apply a second coat how much more vibrant that becomes, giving you a clear example of why it's a good idea to do two very thin coats, even with detailed pieces like this where it appears to have paint coverage. A second thin coat is always a good idea, particularly for base coats. That might seem like I'm going a bit over the top with such a small piece, constantly going over the ridges on the tail, but it's simply because the paint isn't actually going in half as well as I'd like into the ridges, and in order to ensure that everything looks good later, I've got to kind of force the paint right in there. Oh, and I missed this section on the previous coat. There is actually a bit of red flesh to paint around the tip of the tail, so I'm just going over it here, so you can be sure what I was talking about earlier. It was just these little areas. It's not much. I did it off camera for the first coat. Now, having done the first side and the middle and the tip of the tail, that just leaves the second side to do. This should be fairly easy. Same again, just making sure that I get paint into all of the ridges by painting in the same direction as them. I think this is beginning to show the main reason why you do a second thin coat is just to give it that, good colour coverage. Make sure it's a nice solid foundation for anything else you want to do. If you want to leave it here, that's fine. But if you start to shade and highlight it, this gives you the absolute best foundation for it. This nice, vibrant red colour that covers every part that you want to be red with this nice red. So it just makes it easier to do the later steps. Now moving on to the head, it's particularly important to get a good base coat on the head because it's always the focal point. Even though this is a very strange alien creature and it doesn't really look human at all, it's nevertheless going to be the focal point for the entire model, and so you do want to get a good base coat, and you'll actually probably end up highlighting and focusing on the face in particular, particularly around the eyes, much more than any other part of the model, because that's generally what people identify with. If they can see the eyes of the model, that's what they identify with. So that's what they're going to be looking for, and so you do take a lot of care and attention. So even though this is a small piece, I'm taking my time just to get paint in everywhere without messing it up. That is easier said than done though, because there are a lot of deep recesses around the eyes. There's a lot of sort of crater-like marks which are very difficult to get paint in, and then there's these kind of veins everywhere towards the back of the head that it can be difficult to get paint in all the right directions rather than merely the right places. So do take a bit of extra care and attention on this particular part of the model. Weirdly, the underside of the head is comparatively simple. There is a kind of ridge at the bottom, but other than that, the chin is flat. The underside of the face, either side of that ridge, is just slightly curved. It's not particularly complicated. So, and plus, of course, when the model's just standing up, you won't actually see this part, but I still like to get a good coverage paint on it. You can see how the underside of the jaw and chin is now quite a bit darker than the surrounding area. That's the difference between one coat and two coats. The other deep crevices are around the teeth. I always actually paint these in the base colour, which I've actually found once I've used a wash on it provides a suitable dark colour for the inside of the mouth that's kind of red, but then once you paint the teeth over that, it actually looks right. So I'm sticking with it like that for now. Okay, back to the sword arm, and this time I'm going to try and flip the block round so you can mainly see the arm that I'm painting rather than the underside of the block. As you can see here though, this is another example where it went on really thin before, and although at first glance it looked like a good red, now that you see the second coat going on, you realise how weak that first coat was and how incredibly thin it was over the black. It does take two coats when it's like this to make it look good. And in some paints that isn't like a Games Workshop base paint, if you use a layer paint or some other manufacturer's paint, you might find that sometimes two coats aren't enough to achieve this level of coverage. You may still need to use, 3 or 4 coats, whatever's needed to get the effect you want. Sorry that the part is actually wobbling around like crazy. I'm trying to steady it with my thumb, but it is on the end of a slim piece of wire, so if I don't steady it somehow, it's going to be wobbling all over the place, which doesn't make it very easy to paint, but I'm managing. Now, with these deep recesses, using a slightly smaller brush with a finer point makes it a lot easier to get paint into those details. With hindsight with the arms, it might have made more sense to use this brush for the original coat. It would have actually made lighter work of it, but you know, we live and learn, so maybe next time. I have got 2 more of these to paint, so when I say next time, there will actually be a next time. Now there'll be a brief interlude whilst I top up the paint on the palette, including some water to make it thin. A bit more paint, probably a bit more water, get it the right consistency, rotate the brush to make a thin point, and then we just carry on. It does need a fine point to get into all of the details around the fingers, particularly in the sword hilt. Right, getting back to the whip arm again. This one did have slightly better coverage, so it's a bit more questionable if you need to do a second coat, but again, as I'm second coating absolutely everything, this just makes sure that it has the same consistency as all the rest of the model. You could pick and choose, but you have to really evaluate which parts are covered well and which parts are not. As you can see, I've just put some paint on the upper arm and the lower arm looks dull, so it's probably still worth doing. Now it's worth noting the paint I'm using here is slightly less watered down than some of the earlier parts. I'm just finding it's giving slightly better coverage. It is a fine judgment, and it's something that as you learn to paint and you get more used to it, you kind of get used to the level of paint and water that you need to have thin enough paint, but paint that still covers everything up. It's a fine judgment, and I'm afraid it only comes with practice. So sorry if that's a bit of a confusing explanation, but it is just one of those things that you learn by painting your miniatures and by using a palette and some water and some paint. Now again, the fine tip brush is making light work of the fingers and the sort of valleys in between them. However, you will notice I'm having to go back to the palette quite often to get paint. It's the disadvantage of smaller, finer tip brushes. They don't hold as much paint and the paint dries on the bristles much more quickly, so you have to keep an eye on that. I am actually washing the brush in between video clips. And finally, the gun arms again. Same sort of consistency as the previous clip. Just going over again the lower arm. Noticing that on this one, although I don't make a fuss about it now, there is actually a bubble in the paint on the back of the arm, which is slightly annoying, but I can just pass that off as a modelling detail or fill it in later. I'll see what happens. But just putting the paint on. Again, the coverage on these is not terrible, but in order to be consistent with the rest of the model, I've got to do 2 thin coats on this now, just so that it has the same foundation to apply the shades and the highlights and so on later on. If my painting pattern and behaviour look ever so slightly different in this video, it's partly because I'm using the smaller brush, and I can easily get, for example, between the 2 spikes on the elbow, and I can get into the ridge that's actually on kind of the cuff area of the model and things like that much more easily, whereas before I was kind of skipping them. This is, again, a reason for using a fine tip brush, but also a reason for doing a second coat, because of course some of those details may have been missed entirely, and some small areas may actually have this as the very first coat. So it's an excellent idea to do 2 coats, and by following with a slightly smaller brush, you can be sure to go over any areas you missed as well. Now we are finally getting towards the end of the video. If you've watched this far, thank you very much for watching all of this. This has been by far the longest video I've ever put together, partly because I'm showing the first coat and then the second coat, but also I've had to take my time with this one over several days to actually get the paint laid down on this thing. So it's obviously a lot more footage than usual, but I'm actually kind of hoping to do videos more like this in the future. So if you have put up with it so far, thank you. The kind of black line that I'm leaving on the arm isn't actually on the arm, it's a separate piece that's a kind of cable, well, I suppose these don't really have cables being organic creatures, but some sort of tube running from the shoulder into the gun. So it looks like I'm missing a part of the arm. It's actually part of the gun assembly, which will be painted a different colour later. It will be painted a delightful sort of bloody flesh colour, which I will go into detail of in a future video. Now I am overlapping quite heavily with the handle on the gun, actually slightly overpainting this. This will need to be corrected, and the handle will need to be painted grey afterwards. It's just a lot easier to paint the fingers and the hand red and then paint in the grey afterwards. It just makes the process a lot easier later. I've tried it both ways. This is the easy way.
Right, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you get notifications about when the next video will be out. I hope that will be soon. Thank you for watching.